Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Scorza. I'm here with Collective Liberation. Um, my pronouns are she, her, ella. I am wearing a black t-shirt with a text that reads, "Museums are not neutral," and I'm sitting in front of a white wall and a textile artwork by artist Claudia Cano. By inclusively introducing myself and acknowledging I acknowledge the diversity of our community and strive to create a sense of belonging. I welcome you from my home in the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay in San Diego, California, Northern Baja. The Kumeyaay have stewarded these lands for generations, and I extend my gratitude to the Indigenous peoples in my region for the opportunity to live, work, and learn in their traditional homelands. Now, as you know, we usually collaborate with local Indigenous communities to help develop land acknowledgement specific to our conference location. This year, we're joined by many people from many places. So instead, we ask that you please take a moment to reflect on the history, social circumstances, and personal experiences that bring us to this moment. We ask that you consider whose ancestral home we occupy where you reside. What circumstances brought you to this moment, and how do you carry your ancestors with you? We are almost done with this on conference. We have one more session after this, a reflective session where we invite everyone that's participating throughout this 3 days of learning to join us to share what are some of the things that you're taking away and how will you manifest. Today's session, Museum Unions Organizing Workshop, is presented by Amanda Tobin, Maro Elliott, Whitney Stanley, and Michaela Flint. It is my pleasure to welcome this group of people who've been um, moving us in the right direction, should I say, to inform what our museums could look like and how they can support our staff and better labor practices. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on the microphone to our presenters. For those interested in asking questions, we invite you to use the Q&A feature. My fellow moderators and I will be monitoring that and passing on questions to our presenters at the end. So again, Amanda, I think you'll be the one getting us started.
Yes. So if you want to advance to our first slide, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you to the organizers of Collective Liberations and the folks on this call in particular, and everyone behind the scenes who have been able to make this incredible week happen for all of us. I know we all feel very honored to be part of the lineup and are very grateful to the other presenters this week. This Museum Unions organizing workshop today is really geared towards getting an understanding of what unions are and how they can help our institutions become more equitable spaces. And also really going into the nuts and bolts on how to start an organizing campaign at your institution. And then we'll end with a Q&A to try and get to some of your specific questions if we have time. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We'll start with introductions, who we are, the four of us, and what we bring to this work. We're representing two different organizing campaigns at MASS MoCA and the Portland Museum of Art. My name is Amanda Tobin. I use she, her pronouns. And I was an organizer with the MASS MoCA Union and recently stepped away from my position as Associate Director of Education at the museum to pursue a different path and go back to grad school. But I really wanted to just start out by sharing about how this journey came to be for MASS MoCA. And unionizing was something a few colleagues and I used to talk about really sort of offhand, like MASS MoCA really could use a union in our moments of frustration. But we were often afraid of losing our jobs, feeling very nervous about what would happen if we actually went forward with it. And then comes the pandemic, and MASS MoCA was one of the first institutions to do widespread layoffs, and 75% of us, myself included, were laid off last March. And it really was handled in a way that demonstrated how disposable we were to the institution as workers. And I had been there for about 7 years at that point and really felt very discouraged by how that all happened. So when the museum was able to rehire me when it received a PPP loan a couple months later, it was one of the first things I started to think about was, okay, I already lost my job. I was afraid if that had happened. So now that I'm back, how can I start to make this a reality? So I teamed up with my colleagues, and we'll go into more of that story in a little bit. But that's a little bit of how I came to this process. And I want to also just add that I was absolutely brand new to unionizing. I've learned a lot about the labor movement in this process, and I still have a lot to learn, but I think it's important to underscore that none of us had any experience, and we all made it happen anyway. So I know Michaela's having some internet issues, but Michaela, are you able to chime in and introduce yourself?
Yes, unfortunately, I can't show my face at the moment. Can you hear me? Well,
Yeah.
yes? Okay, good. Unfortunately, my internet has decided to act up right now. But hello, my name is Michaela Flint. I was an employee of the Portland Museum of Art. I was first employed late December 2018, and I was laid off in February of 2021. And during that short period of time, I wore many hats. I started off in security, and then I was a VME, which stands for Visitors and Members Experience. And I ended my career at the museum as a gallery ambassador. And during that time, I saw a lot of inequality when it comes to especially lower paid employees, lack of benefits, lack of living wages. And I was not happy with that. And I wanted to be a part of a really good structural change in the museum, not only for myself, but for future employees. So I was very excited to be part of this union and unionizing, and I was very vocal with my support. Unfortunately, my vocal support led to me to not be employed by the museum, but I'm happy to speak with everyone today, and I'm very grateful for being asked to speak, and I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. So Michaela and I were colleagues at the Portland Museum of Art and worked together closely on this organizing campaign. My name is Whitney Stanley. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Associate Registrar and Collection Data Manager at the PMA. I've been there for about 3 years, but I've been in the museum field for 13. I've worked multiple positions within the field, including visitor services, conservation, curatorial, and then finally landing in collections management and registration. So I have firsthand experience with the inequalities within museums and how people in different sectors often get different benefits, different terms of employment. And for that reason, I was really interested in forming a union.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being with us. My name is Maro Elliott. My pronouns are she, her, and I've spent my career in fundraising for arts and culture nonprofits. And for the past 3 years, I've worked at MASS MoCA as the manager of institutional giving. And I previously worked at MASS MoCA from 2011 to 2013 as a development intern, which is when I first met Amanda. And then I was the development assistant. And I wanted to say that I have felt able to be actively and vocally supportive of this work at MASS MoCA, in part because of my positionality and privilege. I'm a white cis woman with a safety net, and I'm in a role at the museum that's less precarious than most of my coworkers. For example, as Amanda mentioned, when 70% of our staff was laid off at the beginning of the pandemic, there were no layoffs in the development department. And I was brought to this work by years of experiencing many passionate and dedicated colleagues in the field being undervalued, underpaid, and overworked. And after not having our concerns taken seriously by our employers and seeing the gains that have been made by other unions, it became clear that banding together and working as a collective would be the best way to improve our working conditions and the museum and to support and strengthen the field as a whole. And organizing, I can say, has made me and my colleagues very optimistic about the future of museums. And I feel very lucky to be doing this work. And I guess I'd also like to thank at the top local, our UAW Local 2110, which is MASS MoCA's and the PMA's parent organizers for bringing us together. And now I think we're ready to begin our presentation with Whitney speaking about why unions.
Yes, next slide, great. So it's pretty self-explanatory, these bullet points. These are things that we all want in our place of work. The first being transparency and accountability. So one way that you can get this through a union is through the initial request for information that is required to begin the bargaining process. So this includes information like wages for every employee in the bargaining unit, museum policies and procedures, benefits, basically anything that could impact the contract or things that you would bargain over with your employer. And the contract is a form of accountability for your employer. And Maro will talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as what you said, in addition to transparency and accountability, forming a union provides employees with legal support and protection. As when you were saying, the contract that's negotiated by members of the union in cooperation with management is legally binding. And also, as Whitney said, the contract protects employee compensation and benefits and sets workplace rights and job security. And contracts also often have a grievance procedure. And so all of this within our contract, having it being legally binding, really helps to hold our institutions accountable. And also, it is our democratic and legal right to be unionizing. It's legal to discuss unionizing at work, although we certainly recommend being discreet about it. And it's also illegal for employers to retaliate against employees who are engaging in organizing efforts, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. And unions also provide legal support through union hired legal counsel. So union appointed lawyers provide support in the event that any appeals are made during the unionizing process, which we'll also discuss more later. And lawyers also provide support during the bargaining process and later in the event that there are any workplace disputes that require arbitration. And Michaela, talk about working conditions.
Yes, and also I'd like to add, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yes, good. Unions provide support for front-facing staff that includes anyone for the front desk or anyone in facilities. Relating it to relevancy of COVID, providing safety equipment such as gloves, masks, hand sanitizer, anything that museum employees could need for personal safety, and also provide training, proper training for anyone in facilities when it comes to particularly dangerous machinery, anything that can protect front-facing staff, and that would be very beneficial when it comes to unions.
And another thing that came up, I mean, solidarity is obviously a buzzword for unions, but it's was very real. And one of the joys of the organizing process for me was getting to know my colleagues in a different way. And we talk a lot about the issue of silos within museums and departments competing for limited resources and things like that. And unionizing was the project that broke that down for me, unlike anything else I had experienced while working at MASS MoCA. And, you know, it brought me closer to actually know colleagues instead of just waving or nodding at them in the hallway. You know, there might be custodial staff who I say hello to when they empty the trash in my office, and it never went beyond that until unionizing and actually talking to people. And we, in our resources slide at the end, we link to a Jacobin article that cites recent research that unions also build solidarity across racial backgrounds, that when you have a common purpose, racial animosity can start to disappear or diminish. So there are studies that say that white workers who are unionized tend to have more progressive attitudes towards race relations, towards policies like affirmative action. So while, of course, the history of unions is complicated with some very inspiring stories about race and power, it also has really problematic stories. But I think that there's a lot of potential for them to be used as a force towards racial solidarity. So next slide, please. We want to start getting into some of the details of what organizing looks like and how it happens, just with a timeline that is not to scale. I'm not very tech savvy, so my apologies. But this sort of shows you how much is really concentrated behind the scenes before a unionizing campaign goes public. So all of the blue is that back work that needs to happen before you can start your Instagram page and have your election. So we'll go into all of these details in more depth, but again, we're going to share these slides with you at the end of the presentation so you can take a closer look later and really see an example, and every situation will be very different depending on the unique circumstances, but this is what MASS MoCA's timeline looked like. Next slide, please. So Whitney, over to you.
Yeah, so getting started. First, you just want to start having conversations with your colleagues. And a good icebreaker is just checking in with them to see how they're doing in their work life. I know that people are always looking for an opportunity to talk about that, especially with people that you already have a rapport with. So that's a good place to start in identifying your allies who might also want to form a union. I know that Amanda mentioned that the layoffs at MASS MoCA were a really good icebreaker when they were forming their union. And that was also sort of the case at the PNA. We didn't have layoffs in the same way, but we all connected with each other on how we were experiencing the pandemic and the decisions that were being made by leadership.
So once you have a core group of people who are interested in moving forward, it's time to connect with a parent union. And as someone mentioned earlier, we're all represented by Local 2110, which is a division of the United Auto Workers Union. I'm wearing their t-shirt today. And the sort of goal of this stage is to figure out and almost do a dating period to find a parent union that is the right fit for your workplace. And so one way to do that is to connect with other workers in other unionized places and just get a sense from them of how they interact with their union, whether they like them, what the sort of pros and cons are. In our case, we had reached out to colleagues at the Philadelphia Museum of Art first and just had a sort of listening session with them through a former MASS MoCA colleague. And then their union is specific to Philadelphia, so we kept looking, and I watched a NICMER panel last year with Maida Rosenstein, the president of Local 2110, and was very inspired by her, and just also she shared her information. So I sent an email, and within a few hours she had responded, and through initial conversations it really seemed to be a good match for MASS MoCA to work with Local 2110.
And another part of this process that I found helpful was looking into the bargaining agreements that had already been made by Local 2110 with their shops. So yeah, I highly recommend doing that. It's available. They're available on their website. So on to Whitney.
Yeah, so both of our campaigns organized during a pandemic, which was a unique challenge. It's often easier to have conversations with your colleagues when you're physically in person. I found it really difficult personally to find times to speak with people, to make sure that they had the right technology to engage in conversations about the union, um, and really the emotional bandwidth, because this year has been really traumatic in a lot of ways. Um, so leading with empathy for your colleagues is really the most important, and flexibility. And I know Maro has some other thoughts on that.
I would just emphasize that correct conversations are critical, and I'd say that sort of a mistake that I made in my initial conversations with people was sort of bombarding them with information because I was so excited about the unionizing process and everything that I had learned. But I think I sort of overloaded people with information rather than really listening and having a more fluid conversation.
Yeah, and thinking about ways to break down barriers to having conversations is really important. And on the flip side of things, it actually was easier to have conversations that were confidential while working off-site. Um, so, another barrier could be if people have families or other outside obligations. So trying to work around people's schedules, it doesn't sound revolutionary, but going in, uh, you know, understanding that this is scary for people. And you need to meet them where they're at in order to initiate the conversation. Yeah, so after you start having those conversations, you've identified your parent union, you start meeting once a week, ideally. And the union organizers will help coach you on how to have good conversations, how to identify other allies and recruit other people to the organizing committee. And they're also there to advise on the actual technical process of forming a union, which we will start getting into a little further into the presentation.
And of course, there are challenges along the way. I like Mara, also had moments of scaring people off because of my enthusiasm, my information overload. One of the things that we encountered pretty regularly at MASS MoCA was that there was a lot of turnover, particularly with part-time positions in our custodial team and our front of house staff. And so we'd sort of get someone on board and then they would leave the institution and we'd have to start over with their replacements. And one of the ways that we worked around that was just by making sure that our organizing committee was really broadly representative of the institution and had strong members from every department, so that if there was turnover in maintenance, our maintenance core person could then bring on board the new staff and try and recruit them to our efforts.
And another possible challenge during this might be kind of determining who is or is not eligible to be part of the bargaining unit. And that those determinations will be made with the support of your parent union, but managers and supervisors to start cannot be in the bargaining unit. And manager is defined as someone who has hiring or firing power or independent decision-making power. So although your title, for example, might have manager in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be excluded from eligibility in the bargaining unit. It really depends on the specific responsibilities of your role. Also staff with access to sensitive financial or personnel information might also sometimes be excluded from the bargaining unit potentially. So, certain HR representatives or possible or executive assistants. In addition, security staff would need to form their own union apart from the other regular larger bargaining unit because of bad labor law precedents. And also, I should say that it's possible that the positions that are determined by the union as eligible for inclusion in the union, the employer later in the process might disagree. And this could be an attempt by employers to make the bargaining unit smaller and thereby weakening the unit. And at MASS MoCA, thankfully, we've only had a few positions that were contested. And that was not the case at the PMA, which we will hear more about later. Next slide, please.
I'm also seeing the question, before I go into this slide, I just want to address Megan's question in the chat. Do you have a recommendation on the size of the organizing committee, that it should be representative of the institution, but an ideal size? And I don't know if any of the other presenters want to weigh in, but I know we had in a staff of about 100 people who are eligible for the unit. We probably had about 10 to 15 people who were part of the org committee, but about 8 of us regularly showed up to meetings, and that would fluctuate. Would you agree, Maro, that that seems right? Yeah, and I don't know if Whitney or Michaela, you want to weigh in from the PMA.
You know, I would just say it really varies. A lot of it's dependent on how many people are willing to take the risk to be a vocal union supporter and dedicate the time. So that is a huge factor. We try to talk to as many people in the bargaining unit as possible to get them involved in the organizing committee. But your union organizers will also advise on appropriate size of the organizing committee. Yeah, and who should be carrying certain conversations.
Thanks. All right, so once you've had your conversations, the sort of goal eventually, besides just listening to your colleagues and what their workplace concerns are, would be to get a commitment that they're willing to sign a union support card. And what this is right now, these are digital cards that say, you know, I, Amanda Tobin, pledge to vote yes in a union election, should one take place at MASS MoCA. And here on the slide, you can see some of the text that can go along with it. There's sort of the legal requirements, and then you can embellish it a little bit. So the PMA put their union mission statement on there. We did that as well as at MASS MoCA. We also put the names of some solid supporters so that people knew the sort of human side of this forum, who their colleagues were, who they could turn to and ask questions. This is anonymous. Your information will only be seen by the parent union and the labor board. So management should never see who signs a card.
And in order for the next step in the process to be the next step, you need to have at least 30% of your staff sign cards. But we were able to get a supermajority, as many of our fellow museums have, of staff members who have shown their support. So the more people, the stronger the union.
Next slide, please. So once you have your supermajority of cards signed, you can officially file for an election. And so what this means is that there's a one-page form that gets sent off to the labor board, and the parent union will do this step for you, along with the copies of the cards that say, here we can demonstrate there's a majority, there's the legal 30% threshold, and then the supermajority that most unions recommend. And it sort of sets in motion all of these official deadlines for both the labor board, the union, and the institution. So this is when you go public. Management will receive a copy of just that one-page form. And then they have a certain number of days to comply with different requirements, like sending a complete list of eligible staff to the union, giving mailing addresses out so that the labor board can send the mail-in ballots, and that, sort of thing to just get things going. And then Michaela, if you want to jump in and talk about the press.
Yes, thank you. I would have to say, if you're considering speaking to the press, it's a really big decision individually because it can be used against you while you're working at an institution or a museum. So I would highly encourage checking your employee handbook for the guidelines when it comes to speaking against the museum or speaking about the museum, just so you have a little extra safety net and a little protection just in case something comes up in the future against you. Also, before you speak to the press, I highly encourage speaking to your team and speaking to your union representatives about what you can and cannot share. This is just to prevent any backlash if you accidentally share something that's just too much information, maybe safety thing for your organizing. And those are the biggest tips I highly encourage if you're considering speaking to the press. Whitney?
Yeah, I apologize. There are dogs barking in the background. So yeah, our social media is a really good tool to use in conjunction with any press. So we had our social media accounts ready to go as soon as we filed. You want to make sure that your messages are consistent between quotes to journalists and what you're putting out on Instagram or Twitter. So one of the earliest things we did in our campaign was selfies. So we asked staff members to make a selfie holding up a sign saying why they supported the union. And that's the image you saw in the first slide. So it's a great way to demonstrate solidarity, normalize the union, and to demonstrate what unions can do for employees.
Next slide, please. Also, as in preparation and in advance of the election period, it's important to go through a process of helping to inoculate your coworkers, which will mentally prepare them for the possible anti-union campaign by their employers. So during this process, it's important to help your coworkers to understand why your employer might fight against the union. It's important to discuss specific anti-union arguments and to explain the tactics that are likely to be used in an anti-union campaign. And because so many employers do campaign aggressively against unionization, it's important to know which of their responses are legal and which are illegal. And so although it's not illegal for your employers to express their opinions, many do use information and distortion to disparage unionizing campaigns, but they can express their opinions. But the acronym here, TIPS, is a good way to remember which actions by employers are illegal. So T, we have threaten. It's illegal to threaten, discipline, or discriminate against employees because of their support for a union. It's illegal to interrogate, to ask employees about their support for a union or about the support of their peers. And S, they cannot survey on employees' union activities.
The next slide.
Next.
So then you get to the fun part where you find out how management is going to respond. And labor laws in the US are really not geared to support workers. So this can be a very challenging stage. And museums, because they're nonprofits, they might not take an explicitly anti-union stance the way Amazon or Google will, but instead they'll look towards different what's called union avoidance law firms, a sort of euphemism, and use whatever legal tactics are available to delay the process, diminish the bargaining unit, or defeat a union drive. And Chelsea, we're going to talk about the PRO Act. I see your comment there too, so we'll get there. But so with that all in mind, we were very lucky at MASS MoCA that management decided to be neutral. which meant that they would not interfere at all with the process once everything was set in motion for our election. Organizations can also voluntarily recognize a union, which is sort of best case scenario. But MASS MoCA went with neutrality, which was almost just as good. And our colleagues at the PMA have a very different story to tell. So if you want to take it from here, Michaela.
I think Michaela's internet is not
Yes.
working. Oh, great. If you're here,
I might be able, I'm sorry, it's crashing. So it might block me out when I'm.
Okay, I'm going to start. So yeah, the Portland Museum of Art did fight our union in a number of different ways, primarily legal challenges and captive audience meetings. So the first sort of legal challenge that we ran into was about the position of gallery ambassadors. So about a month prior to filing our union petition, the departments of visitor member experience and security were merged. The idea by leadership was to remove policing in the galleries. So they said nobody who is in the galleries is a security guard anymore. They were there to be welcoming to visitors. When we filed the union petition, they contested the inclusion of those new roles, gallery ambassadors, as being security guards. So the regional office of the NLRB saw the case. They ruled in favor of the union. Our position was that those roles are not security guards. But then the museum appealed to the national office of the NLRB. And I do think it's worth noting that at the time, it was a Trump labor board, so it was more conservative. But we did end up having our election in late November, early December of 2020. Our ballots were impounded because of that appeal that the PMA submitted about the bargaining unit. Once the NLRB saw the case, they ruled in favor of the museum. So our bargaining unit was cut by about a third. Once that case was settled, though, we were able to have our ballots counted. So the ballot count took place in April, late April, and we received our certification in early May. So that's kind of the short and sweet of the legal challenges. And it took many, many months to get our certification. So yeah, the captive audience meetings, and this is where the PRO Act comes into the picture. The PRO Act would prohibit captive audience meetings. So what that means, it's a meeting that your employer requires you to attend where they talk about the union. In our case, it was a weekly all-staff meeting. It was typically at the end of the meeting where leadership would present their reasons why they didn't want a union. A lot of it was very standard anti-union language, and that's where inoculation is really important. You can get ahead of it to some extent, but it is still very damaging. People are forced to sit through very intimidating, tense situations, and it's really difficult to be a vocal union supporter in that situation. So vocal support was limited by those meetings. Yeah, and it was also an opportunity for leadership to undermine statements that were made by union supporters and therefore disrupt solidarity among our bargaining unit. So please support the PRO Act, make sure it gets passed. Yeah, and obviously I think it goes without saying that our employer did hire a union avoidance firm as well. So Michaela, if you're there, if you want to talk a little bit about how we handled those captive audience meetings.
I can try. I can try. Hopefully I don't crash again. So like Whitney said, those meetings were highly aggressive. And I would have to say the questions that we were receiving were incredibly repetitive.
So I think we lost her. Yeah, so we were also being asked questions by others in the bargaining unit, the same questions. It was a sort of unconsensual opportunity for leadership to say, hey, you can ask union organizers your questions in these all staff meetings, to which we responded, this is not a space that is safe. It is controlled by leadership and our supervisors are here. So we don't feel comfortable speaking in this space. And we did actually say that at a certain point during an all staff meeting. And after that, we just didn't speak. I think it's also really important to check in with your colleagues after those meetings because they can be really stressful. And in a way, it was a way to build solidarity among the organizing committee. We sort of bonded through that trauma, but I would not wish it upon anyone else in their union drives.
And I think MASS MoCA, we followed the PMA and other organizing campaigns, and I think we benefited from that because MASS MoCA saw the writing on the wall and could see the other campaigns that were winning election after election in spite of anti-union campaigns that management threw at them. And also saw how terrible it made institutions like the PMA or the Philadelphia Museum look, that it was really not reflecting well on them. So hopefully, as more and more museums unionize, this becomes more of the situation where management can see that they're fighting a losing battle and they're just going to waste money and throw so much money at these law firms rather than working to actually heal their workplace cultures. So next slide, please. And I know we are coming close towards the end of our time and still have a ways to go. So I'm going to go a little bit faster through this. But once the labor board and the union and the institution work out some of these legal details, you can set your election date, which because of the pandemic was a mail-in election window. So some people, there are pros and cons. People could submit their ballots, fill them out in the privacy of their homes. But just like in the general election this past year, you have to really be on top of people and make sure that they actually get it in the mail. And then the NLRB hosts a live Zoom session where they count every single ballot in front of lawyers from both teams and open to the public, which was sort of the driest and most exciting Zoom I think I've ever seen. And then you get your election from there. And then Whitney, do you want to talk quickly about bargaining?
Yeah, so we are at the stage where we're electing our bargaining committee. So we haven't started bargaining yet. But within your organizing committee, you will determine what an appropriate number of seats are on the committee. If more people than, sorry, this is kind of hard to say. If, for example, like we had, let's say, in a large institution, 8 positions. If more than 8 people accept their nomination, it goes to an election process. And once that committee is elected, you bargain with the employer over time and place of negotiations. So it can mean trying to schedule bargaining sessions after work because you might have front-facing staff that can't bargain during normal open hours, or it could mean exempt staff using their time during the workday to bargain. It really depends on what your bargaining committee needs and what your employer will agree to. It is a negotiation. So yeah, I haven't bargained yet. I'm really looking forward to the whole process. I don't know if Maro wants to talk about the contract or negotiating. Sure. Yeah.
So I'll also say that MASS MoCA too has yet to begin the bargaining phase. We are right about to elect our bargaining committee. And as we've said before, the objective of bargaining is to create this legally binding contract or collective bargaining agreement. And throughout the bargaining process, lawyers, or rather employers have a legal obligation to bargain in good faith with their unionized employees. And I guess I'll just list a couple of examples of not bargaining in good faith. They might be failing to meet with the union at reasonable times and with reasonable frequency, which Whitney had mentioned earlier, refusing to provide the union with requested information that the union needs in order to have an informed bargaining process. And then also, right, to fail to bargain in good faith concerning mandatory subjects of bargaining. So there are subjects that are mandatory and others that are not. That's for another time. So what, clearly what is included in a contract, you learn through all of the many conversations and ongoing conversations that you've had with your colleagues to have a sense of what their priorities are. We've also recently at MASS MoCA sent out a bargaining survey in which our coworkers will let us know what about our work they'd like to keep the same and what they think needs improving upon. And so once you know what you'd like to bargain for, you make a proposal to management. Management comes back with a counter offer, and so this process continues. Both in consultation with the committee members, with the rest of the union, as well as potentially legal counsel. So once that is finalized and the contract is signed, that's when union dues kick in. And so union dues are really how unions get their power and their resources. They pay for our parent union staff salaries, legal counsel, and they also help through these things other people organize. So by paying union dues, we are all supporting this incredible wave of organizations who are unionizing. And we've all said that we're looking for paying dues so that we can support our other colleagues. Next slide.
And actually one more slide, we missed this one, so we'll just keep going. So quickly, some of the lessons that we learned from our two campaigns. One of them is the importance of public support, and especially having that public support ready to go when you go public. So the social media letters of support, we secured some from the North Adams Teachers Union, a UMass faculty union. We had a letter of support from our sister shop at the New Museum as well. And also all of this came in, these sort of members and individuals could send in letters through the union website, and each of the letters got copied to info@massmoca.org so that management knew every single time another letter came in. And this was all in the face of a sort of coincidental bad PR the museum was experiencing. As different effort called Change Berkshire Culture had just broken on Instagram. It's a sort of smaller version of Change the Museum. And so MASS MoCA was having a lot of its dirty laundry out in the open. And in conversations with some people in the community, people would say to me, oh, I'm so sorry to hear what you've been going through. I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes at the museum. I thought, how can I continue being a member? And then I learned about the union effort, and I thought, okay, this makes me feel much better about being able to continue and go to MASS MoCA again, knowing that somebody's looking out for the workers.
And as we've said many times, conversations are fundamental to this work, and having strong conversations and ongoing conversations throughout every step of the process to make sure that everyone, all of your coworkers and you are all on the same page and understand each other's priorities and experiences. Now onto the PMA for their lessons.
Yeah, I'll speak up. I know Michaela was going to take this section. Our takeaways were very similar to our colleagues at MASS MoCA. So all I would really add to it is that you really need to be flexible through this process and, be willing to expect the unexpected to some extent. we weren't expecting the PMA to take such an aggressive anti-union stance, but we were prepared for it with really good support. So lean on your union organizers, lean on each other, and be patient.
So our next slide is resources that we wanted to share just to give you some context to the current organizing effort within the cultural sector, and then a highlight of some of the social media accounts you can follow to learn more. But obviously this is not comprehensive. It seems like there's a new effort breaking every day. But we'll ask the Collective Liberations team to put that in the chat so you can all see the slides at your convenience. And then lastly, if you want to go to the final slide, we want to have a call to action to all of you. We mentioned the PRO Act already, so this is up for debate right now, and we need your help. Everybody should call their representatives to urge them to support passing the PRO Act, which would help union campaigns get going, outlawing those things like the captive audience meetings that the PMA had to experience. So learn more about that and advocate for that to happen. And then if you have the inclination or ability, start a campaign at your institution, particularly if you can take some risks. So like Maro mentioned, I'm, have a similar positionality of being a white cis woman. Yes, I was laid off, but then when I was rehired, I had influential donors coming to my defense saying, how could you lay off Amanda Tobin? And so I had leverage, right? And so I knew that my position was more secure than perhaps some of our front of house staff or others who we've seen bear the brunt of the layoffs during the pandemic. So we know there are a lot of white ladies in museum work in general. So let's change some things. Use that position if you can. And the final slide has our contact information. Please reach out to any of us if you have more questions. And I know we just have a little bit more time left for some of the other questions that were coming up in the Q&A. But thank you all so much for attending today.
Thank you all. This has been super informative. I appreciate the step-by-step. There's a couple of questions still on the chat that I can read out loud for any of you to answer. And the first one is, do you have any recommendations on size for organizing committee? I understand that it should be representative of the institution, but there is there an ideal size?
We did talk about that one a little bit during the session, and I just didn't mark it because I missed that. Sorry.
So the next one is, how did the fact that PMA hire an anti-union firm to build a campaign against unionizing impact the workplace culture and the relationships between staff and management leadership after unionizing? What is the impact on how do you move forward from that point on?
Yeah, it's really hard. I'm still at the PMA, and it makes for a tense environment, to be quite frank. I was personally sort of expecting them to hire a union avoidance firm, so I was prepared for it. I think my other colleagues that supported the union were also prepared for it, but we didn't anticipate, like I said earlier, such an aggressive anti-union campaign. So that was harder in some ways than the fact that they hired attorneys. And in one of our slides, we actually had a screen grab of a website that the PMA built for their employees, where the PMA presented facts about unions, and also published statements from leadership about our tone as union supporters, and trying to discredit statements that we've made. That was more damaging to our work culture, I think, than the fact that we had anti-union avoidance lawyers hired, if that makes any sense. That felt a lot more personal. But frankly, the expense of the lawyers was it was hard to swallow, in the middle of a pandemic when we're being told that the institution is suffering financially.
Thank you. There's a few more questions. Do you have an info or advice to share for starting a trade union made out of members from different institutions?
I was starting to type a response, and then other people please chime in. It's a really great question, and I think very important for the field because museums so often rely on contract labor, like part-time educators, for example. And I don't know if I have that answer. I know I would maybe start by looking at some of the performing arts sectors and the unions there where they represent actors who work for multiple different organizations, and just having conversations with those folks first. But I'm sorry, I can't answer that more concretely myself.
I think that those are all the questions. I had seen one about membership dues, but I'm not sure if you answered that typing, Amanda.
Yeah, I responded by text. I'll just say again, so Local 2110 charges 2% of your weekly pay. So, or, however often you get a paycheck. So that depends on how much you earn at the institution. So it's equitable in that sense. And you don't start paying any of that until the contract is ratified. So to date, none of us on this call have paid any union dues.
And I'm going to share the link to the slides on the chat in a second. I'm going to move us to the next slide if that's okay with you guys. Just to remember that this is our second to last session of the great 3 days of learning, and our next session is just a reflection session and really talking through what does manifest look like for us, all of us that participated in the sessions. And then before we part, and I promise I will put those links, I just don't want to copy and paste from my background so that I'm not doing that slide change in front of you. I want to thank everyone at Collective Liberation. This is a group effort, mainly volunteer museum employees that joined through these affiliate groups that are Museums and Race, Visitors of Color, Museum Workers Speak, Mass Action, Inclusium, Museums Are Not Neutral, Death to the Museum, The Empathetic Museum. All donations support our speakers and the museum's Workers Relief Fund. So we want to thank you all for participating in today's learning sessions. I hope you gain a lot from this last 3 days of learning and working together. And we look forward to reflecting with you. So I'm going to stop sharing and I will share the link to our colleagues' slides.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Chris, for moderating this session. I wanted to highlight a doc that we started, and like an ask offer doc. We know that people are coming to these sessions looking for lots of different types of conversations. So hopefully that doc can start more points of connecting and building. And I want to thank all of you so much for sharing these resources. I know people are really appreciate your work and are going to learn a lot.
And we had a question about links on the chat. These conversations have been recorded, and I believe we're going to put together a list of resources as they were shared with us by the panelists. So stay on the look for these videos and of the presentations on the Museums and Race YouTube channel and the website. But without further ado, I want to thank everyone and wish everybody a good rest of your afternoon. And I'll see you in a little bit.